I am absolutely delighted to be moderating this session on an equitable economic recovery. I certainly hope so. We all know that the impact of COVID-19 has been devastating, with millions of deaths and massive economic disruption. The world economy is still recovering, and countries across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa are just now starting to reopen and rebuild. This is the time to ask how we rebuild fairly and sustainably, knowing that fresh storms are on the horizon in terms of food and fuel crises. It is my pleasure to introduce our two panelists who have appeared smoothly and magically behind me, who are well placed to shed light on this crucial topic. On my far left is Her Excellency Dr. Rania Al-Mashat. She's the Egyptian Minister for International Cooperation. Prior to that, she was advisor to the chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, in Washington, D.C. To my immediate left is Roger Ferguson. He was the vice chair of the Federal Reserve from 1999 to 2006. As the only governor in Washington, D.C. on 9/11, he led the Fed's response to the terrorist attacks, taking actions that kept the U.S. financial system functioning. Roger is an advisor and board member for several fintech firms and serves on the board of numerous companies, including Alphabet, Google's parent company. He is currently the visiting professor of international finance at Pembroke College, Cambridge University. A very warm welcome to you both. Let me start with Rania. Egypt will be hosting COP27 in November, so the UK COP president, Alok Sharma, at the end of COP26 proclaimed, the 1.5 sea limit lives. We brought it back from the brink, but its pulse remains weak. Many countries still need concrete plans to address global warming, so commitment as well as implementation will be key. Tell us about your ambitions for COP27.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. And when we took a look at Glasgow was a very significant moment in the climate conversation because for the very first time we saw a very strong presence of private capital. And as much as COPs are about negotiations and how we move along the Paris agreement, there's also everyone else. Stakeholders are there, private sector, governments, civil society, MDBs. And so in Glasgow this year, what we saw, instead of just accounting for the 100 billion commitments from governments, with the presence of private sector and philanthropy, we started hearing about the trillions. So we say from billions to trillions. And so what we want in COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, and this is next November, is to try and see how we can translate these commitments into implementation. One very tricky point is that countries that need the money the most are either rated B or below, and therefore for private capital to come into these countries, we need to have innovative tools for financing. And that's where multilateral development banks like the World Bank, IFC, EBRD, European Investment Bank, when they come in with concessional lending, how we can blend the concessional lending with the private capital to de-risk and create an incentive for capital to come into the countries that need it the most, and therefore have the money go into projects in these countries. So that's sort of it looks like a complicated finance model, but that's the only way we can go forward.
Really interesting, thank you. I should mention as well, there'll be a chance to ask questions of this fantastic panel towards the end of this session, so please do feel free to pick up any of these points, or indeed any new ones that you would to ask them about. Roger, the cost of living crisis was with us before Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February. There are now warnings about global hunger due to the impact on wheat and other commodities. In the US and Europe, as well as elsewhere, inflation has reached levels that are reminiscent of the 1970s, which no one wants to repeat. Tell us about the economic policies that can help.
All right, well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And so, speaking as a former central banker, all of you know that the first economic policy that's being implemented that hopefully will impact inflation is raising interest rates. This is something that's going on, the Federal Reserve here in the UK, Bank of Canada, New Zealand, Australia, et cetera. So it's a sort of a global phenomenon. The challenge with raising interest rates in this environment, it is the right thing to do, is that the inflation that we're suffering, as you point out, comes from three separate causes. One of them is, in fact, maybe sort of very loose monetary policy, stimulus policy that needs to be corrected. But we also have inflation coming from geopolitical uncertainties. Russia and the Ukraine account for 30 to 40% of wheat exports, I believe. They also account for sunflower oil exports, which are not so much talked about, but really are important. And then obviously, because of the sanctions, we have oil price increases that are taking hold. And so as we think about the role of monetary policy, as we heard both Chairman Powell say in Washington, we heard Andrew Bailey say yesterday, I think the Federal Reserve and the other central banks are focused on this, but they also know that their tools are blunt. And so the question I think that is before us is, are there other policies that might deal with agriculture, might deal with other commodities? And there we get to trade, we get to fiscal policy. So to date, the focus is monetary policy. That is a blunt tool. We hope to get to what's called a soft landing, but that doesn't necessarily deal with some of the other shocks that we've seen, which come from geopolitical issues that have to be resolved other ways.
A risk of recession?
I have said, and I guess I'll say again, the risk of recession, I think, has become, for many people, uncomfortably high. Here in the UK, in the US, other countries perhaps, I don't know. But I know here in the UK, they've talked to that as a possibility. In the US, there are surveys, other things that suggest that some people are starting to worry about the risk of recession. The question becomes, do we have the risk of a global recession? We have a risk of a global slowdown, interest rates rising, instability that might emerge. In many countries, the vast majority of the household expenditure is going to these areas that are very expensive. So I think we are watching closely to see not just risk of a rough landing in the US, not possibly the risk of rough landing here, but how does that work more globally? And so I think this is something that's very much on people's minds.
Thank you. Rania, the Middle East is particularly affected by the food insecurity caused by the Russia-Ukraine war. This perhaps adds to the challenge from climate change, which would result in reduced crop yields and food insecurity. So just tell us a bit about the impact of recent events on Egypt and the Middle East, please.
Well, let me just say that for the very first time, we're seeing several shocks at the same time. It's food, it's fuel, energy, fertilizer, and financing. When the Fed is tightening, then cost of financing goes up. We were just having a conversation that there's been several years enjoying low interest rates, low inflation, a sense of low risk, if you will. And now all of this is happening at the same time. If I'm talking about Egypt, and I'll just give a footnote there. We are the biggest importer of wheat globally, and our two big markets are Ukraine and Russia. However, a few years ago, there was investment in silos for storage. And storage through silos has a lot of technology, and we're sitting among a crowd where technology is so important. And that's why when we are thinking of solutions to mitigate shocks that might be coming in the future, technology is key. The other is diversification of where you get your crops from. But the other thing which is very, very important, and linking it back to the climate story, adaptation projects which are focused on agriculture and on irrigation come back to the forefront. If we're looking at financing related to projects that protect countries from climate, mitigation came at the forefront for many, many years. Today, this global crisis is putting us back, and this is one of the calls from COP27, because it's in Africa, is a focus on agricultural projects for irrigation agriculture, and trying to create a business case because there are these projects that also generate money for private sector. So again, the climate story, bringing it center stage with what's happening globally, pushes the emphasis on these sizes. But the challenge that policymakers are facing today, and businesses, just because we were coming out of COVID and there was a recovery that was starting, and then 2022, all of us are surprised by these successive shocks that are taking place. So the lesson is agility with policy making, diversification of your, where you get your inputs from. But is it an easy situation? It is not. Today, there's a lot of debate around multilateral dialogue. Are we moving away from that? And I think COVID has shown that we can only find solutions if we work together. And when we work together, it's private sector, governments, civil society, and all of us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Roger, of course, is also the impact of COVID-19 to consider.
Right.
How have recent events affected the ability to recover in a more equitable way?
Well, let's start with first what recent events have been. So I think a few things we've learned. One is, by definition, the linkages are financial, they're through trade, and now we learned, sadly, that health issues are global issues. Now, if this were a room of virologists or public health officials, they would have said to us, well, we warned you years ago that a pandemic was inevitable. MERS, SARS, et cetera, were, in some sense, the globe was fortunate those, I would use the word, burned themselves out before they became a pandemic. So the rest of us have now learned what the experts knew, which is that we're all globally intertwined when it comes to health. Second thing I think we learned is how unequal those impacts are, both across the globe and, frankly, within countries. So in the United States, the vast majority of the impact of health outcomes, negative health outcomes, fell on people of color, some of our poorest zip codes. Those were the places where we had so-called critical workers or essential workers who had to leave their homes, go to work every day, and be exposed to germs. We also saw that the death rate among minorities was much higher than among our white population. And then obviously we think about global inequities, where some countries are well advanced in terms of vaccines, and others are not so. And so the first point is we're intertwined, but impacts are uneven. If we take it to the economics point, obviously we've seen ongoing impacts of COVID and supply chain, which are leading to some of the inflation that we're dealing with. The zero COVID policy in China has had, at this stage, untold, but clearly, or not fully measured, but clearly, discernible impacts on supply chain and supply chain uncertainties. And I think that's continuing as the Chinese continue to focus in on their zero COVID policy. And we've seen that in other countries with very, very uneven openings. And so all of this is sort of intertwined, and it shows what a devilish combination of crises and challenges that we're currently confronting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. If there are any epidemiologists or virologists in the room, I'm going to apologize on behalf of economists who've all become amateur epidemiologists in the past year or so. Ronnie, I want to pose the same question to you, actually. What has been the impact of COVID-19 on the equitable growth agenda?
I mean, one of the groups that were also impacted, women,
Yes.
disproportionately, so that's also to bring that to the fore. But every country was trying to keep the balance between livelihood and lives. Yeah. In our case, we did not have a full lockdown, but it was curfews, so the government tried to always keep economic activity going, given the size of the population and also the need to generate the incomes to get things going. But nonetheless, when we take a look at the population, some were more affected than others, and that's where social safety nets come in. That's where even with the crisis that's happening today, one of the first things that governments try to do is either bring up minimum wages so that people can mitigate some of the impact of these exogenous shocks. They have nothing to do with it, and therefore this is one. If you also during COVID, with some of the population have ration cards, so again trying to increase coverage to basically, again, as you mentioned, try and alleviate this equitable outcome. And the third point, and because everything was moved into a digital space, both in terms of working as well as schooling, trying to make a little bit of leeway when it comes to the policies that would encourage, households, families, parents to actually keep their kids still in school and move ahead. So it's a combination of trying to be very fast with respect to adaptability and also involving being also adaptable when it comes to the private sector. That's a big employer as well for the population. So if I go back, SDGs were mentioned in some of the sessions before. SDGs started in 2015 as the common denominator for all countries and all companies, if you will, to try and take action towards global goals. COVID came in, it was a decade until 2030, so things were backtracked a little bit. Today, that's even more serious with these shocks. So I think making sure that we're not derailed from these goals, because again, they have no poverty, no hunger, gender equality, partnerships. So they're very, very important to always try and remind ourselves that we need to have them core in our business. And that's where, the climate, and I keep on coming back to it, because from it, we can actually make sure that when firms are thinking about their ESGs, that they're also linked to what is needed on the SDGs and what is needed on what governments want to do with climate agenda going forward.
Thank you. I'm going to close off with a couple more questions to my panelists, and there'll be a chance for Q&A, so I will come to the audience in just a few moments. But before I do that, to both of you, if I ask you to step back, and I'll ask Roger first, if you took a holistic look, focusing in on your specific area, perhaps, although both of you could do all the topics, I just realized, but if you focus in specifically a bit, Roger, on a cost of living crisis, what would an equitable economic recovery look like?
Well, look, I think an equitable economic recovery would be one that helped to start the process of resolving some of the issues that have emerged. And it was done in such a way that we take in mind or are very mindful of what we've discovered about the inequalities in the world. And so there are a number of them. We've talked about health inequalities, for example. And so an equitable recovery, I think, has to really say, all right, how do we start to rebuild this post-COVID, post-Ukraine war world, hopefully that comes to us quickly, in a way that is mindful of the weaknesses that have been uncovered. We talked about differences across genders. So in the United States, we have seen that so much of the burden, to your very good point, of taking care of elderly people or children, et cetera, is falling on women as opposed to men. And so we've had women leaving the workforce in the United States disproportionately. So how do we think about rebuilding a world, in the US, President Biden described it as building back better, so that we overcome some of those issues. We also saw in some countries the digital divide. It hasn't been talked about very much here, but the ability to work remotely, or more importantly, or as importantly, the ability to be educated remotely depends very much on having broadband, having Wi-Fi that is consistent. And so I think the whole theory of the case should be we will develop products, we will develop markets, we will develop services that when we come back, take into consideration the lessons that we've learned. The final point I'd make is there's a role, as you've already heard, for the private sector to play here. We're also going to have to create new markets. For example, we're going to need a sustainable, a credible market for carbon offset, because that is going to be part of the solution space here. And so as we think about all of these things, it's creating new policies, new markets, new mindsets that say, we've learned all the inequalities, or many of the inequalities through this series of crises. Let's come out with a series of solutions that not only help us rebuild, but rebuild in a way that's much more equitable.
Thank you. Rania?
For me, I think one of the key lessons or calls going forward is that we do not forget that we need to work together. And I think in this crisis, we've seen that, particularly on trade, many countries have taken decisions to ban exports of certain goods. This has implications all the way everywhere. So I think multilateralism, international cooperation, we need to keep on emphasizing them because any country on its own won't be able to solve the different problems. Just building up on what Roger said, when it comes to tools for financing, there are also SDG bonds, green bonds, private sector issue some of those, governments issue some of those, so also creating multiple tools that can help us mitigate as much as possible what's happening now, and if we're just projecting a few months, and we don't know when the war will be over. It just means that all of this will linger with us for more time. So we need to cooperate more, and cooperation is across countries, but also the different stakeholders. Nobody can fix it alone. I think that's what the outcome of all of this.
Thank you very much. The floor is open if you'd like to ask a question. If you catch my eye, I was going to say you know the drill. And then I've got the gentleman there as well. So Mike is coming.
Thanks. That was really interesting.
Introduce yourself as well. Sorry.
Okay. I'm Karen Deshane. I'm from Kantar in Africa. And so I was just thinking about the opportunity that COP27 presents for Africa. So whilst it'll be a global discussion around Paris Agreement and climate change, etc., but how do we really create those links to the everyday sustainable development goals of no hunger, no poverty, clean water, all those basic things that every company in Africa and in the world could actually be helping, and to almost plan for making that story of Africa wider at that conference. And again, through collaboration and everything, I don't know what the answer is, but I made a note to myself that we run a sustainability baseline study about perceptions that people in each of these countries have about what's important to them. And they don't think about these high-level concepts like climate change, but they do think about their environment that may not be clean, the water, the flooding, the whatever. So I just think it's a great opportunity. It's not really a question, it's just a comment, but maybe you do have an opinion on that.
Thank you. Well, I think that's a step forward right there, writing down the next action you're going to take. But
so climate is a development question or a development angle, and that's why we don't look at it in isolation. So even though it's said climate, but under it comes communities. When we talk about agricultural products, it's the seeds and the produce, and so you have, and even when you take a look at adaptation projects, women come as the catalysts of change in their communities. If we're talking about renewables, you have startups and private sector that actually engages in solar park farms. You talk about governments that have to take decisions to engage private sector. So it's a development question. And I think that's becoming more and more real as we are moving towards 2030 and what the challenges of the COVID brought up. It was a health issue, but then it had everything with it, the inequality, the gender, the education, innovation, etc. So you're absolutely correct, but the answer is climate is not in isolation of development. And that's why there's a very new tool coming out of the World Bank for governments to do. It's called the CCDR, Country Climate Development Reports. So there you have climate and development, and we're talking about development, you're talking about the SDGs.
The only thing I'd add to that is one of the things that wasn't said about my background is for 13 years I led a very large investment company in the United States. And there's a real drive now towards impact investing, where private sector money is looking for opportunities, not just in Africa, but in Africa among other places, where they can invest in a way that solves some of these social issues, bringing private technology to bear and bringing private finance to bear. And I think one of the things that could come out of the COP is this notion of public-private partnerships, private sector money, looking for double bottom line, looking for impact investing, with many great opportunities that exist in almost every community, I would imagine.
Thank you. We'll squeeze in one quick final question there.
Hi, I'm Sebastian from Stepstone. We operate job portals, and obviously we're dealing with people and talent. So one thing that we haven't discussed yet is the demographic transition. Thinking about China, the population will most likely decline or has already started to decline, working population. The same is happening in Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, all of Europe. Thinking beyond the current challenges, how do you think that will change the equation? Also, Rania, to you maybe, what's your perspective from Egypt or even from Northern Africa on what's happening north or in Asia? Thank you.
So we have the opposite. We have 60% young generation, and that's maybe what protected us during COVID in terms of infections and so forth. And skilling this population, making it able to meet the demands internally, but also we have programs with Germany, for example, where some of our trained talent goes and works there. So there is this cooperation as well when it comes to looking at the demographic, disparity or differences between different countries and continents. But this gives us also a very good opportunity when it comes to impact investment and startups, because when you take a look at our region in Egypt and some other countries, there is that very important ecosystem, and it's growing. And this is something that also governments, as well as the private sector that exists currently, is trying to push ahead.
And I'd add two other points to pick up on yours. I think this aging population, which is true, as you observe, almost everywhere except for much of Africa, is a challenge because it creates new pressures on the fiscal authorities. We all have programs to support older folks. We have an increase in what's called the dependency ratio of non-working individuals to people working. And so it is a longer-term challenge. We haven't saved enough in most countries to deal with our aging population, certainly true in the United States, also true in other places. We have different kinds of pension systems, many of which are under stress. The flip side of that, though, to Ranya's point, is we also have to learn how to make these intergenerational workforces more productive. We have to educate younger people. And the other thing that's going to happen as money, back to the investment side of things, is going to flow from older generations to younger generations who have, I think, a much higher interest in some of these ESG topics, a much higher appetite for impact investing. And so we are confronting both the challenge and, with hope, an opportunity as we learn how to sort of work through an aging demographic. But there are definitely challenges associated with it.
Thank you very much. I have to say, the older I get, the less I accept that older people are less productive. But it's just been an absolutely fantastic session. I very much hope that we will build back better. After all, nobody actually wants to build back worse, but we can do something about it. We can become greener, we can become fairer, as we've heard today, and importantly, SDG 17, probably often overlooked, but it's actually about partnerships. It is about the private sector. It's about multilateralism. I think that's the only way we are actually going to build back better into a more equitable economic recovery. So thank you all so much for your fantastic questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but it's been an absolute pleasure to moderate this. And please, will you join me in giving a huge hand to Her Excellency Dr. Rania Al-Mashat and Roger Ferguson, who have just been absolutely fantastic.